Hi friends, host Eric here, host Talking Famous People. I'm taking a quick break in my chore doing, which includes folding laundry and such, because I had a great idea for a title for a video and a concept for a video, and it's not going to take a long time to make it. I just want to throw it out here real quick and then upload it. The title of this video is How Christianity Forced Evolution on Everybody. And I feel that's a fairly provocative title and absolutely true. So, obviously, Christianity, an institution like that, can't really have a specific agenda or will or anything like that. But here's what I mean. There was a time back when the Scopes monkey trial occurred where there was a fracture in the worldviews of the majority of people, such that there was a group of people in general, or half the population, or whatever you want to say, however many of them, that was looking for a scientific explanation for speciation and the origin of human beings. There was another group of people who were insisting that they already had the explanation, and that it was contradictory to the explanation being provided, and that we should prefer the explanation they already had, namely Genesis in the Bible and stuff. So there was this monkey trial, as they called it, and that played out fundamentally as two different affirmations competing against each other. Creationism arguing that they had the explanation, and it was better than evolution's explanation, and evolution arguing that it had the explanation, and that it was better than creationism. And this is how the issue remains framed to this day. You know, my dad was reading Bill Nye inside a book by Bill Nye about creationism. This is how Christianity forced evolution on us. Because, of course, it set the terms by which the debate occurred. It allowed evolution to not be negated properly. So, I'm a debate coach, for those of you who happen to be watching this who don't know. I'm a professional debate coach and pretty successful one, competition flow debate. You could say I'm an expert in rhetoric and argumentation. And so, one of the realities of rhetoric and argumentation is that there are two roles a person plays in any given debate. And that's at the top level frame. You're either negating something or you're affirming something. Now, in the process of negating or affirming, obviously you make various claims. Negating something does not mean you don't make affirmative arguments. It means there's a question at hand that we are debating, and that defines the F and the neg. So the question at hand that we're debating with evolution is origin of the species. Where do people come from? Why, how come there are these different species? How did that happen? And evolution is purporting to explain that. So the proper thing to do in that moment in time in history is to negate evolution on its own terms. In other words, within its own framework. Okay, evolution, you're providing a science explanation for speciation. So let's see if your science explanation can undergo the scientific process, which includes a lot of scrutiny and challenging assumptions and checking to see what predictions a given hypothesis makes, testing those predictions, all that kind of stuff. So for any given claim being made, there's substantiation. And we can look to that substantiation and see if it actually substantiates the claim. In the instance of evolution, scientists have done that ever since evolution came out. But the difference between evolution and other kinds of theories is as each element of Darwin's theory of evolution became discredited by testing, that in fact, okay, well, it's definitely not that, actually. They didn't scrap the theory of evolution. They just kept revising it to be something else. And the reason is because they had mistakenly been frame-walked, so to speak, into the notion that To negate evolution is the same thing as to affirm creationism. And like I said, it exists that way to this day because even recently, Bill Nye purportedly debated evolution with a creationist. But Bill Nye did not debate evolution. Bill Nye debated creationism. He negated creationism. Negating creationism is not the same thing as affirming evolution. And since evolution is the thing that's claiming to explain something, it has the burden to meet. It needs to substantiate those claims. So, for intellectuals out there who think, well, evolution is obviously the right explanation, Eric, the answer to that is not if you do proper deliberation about it. And what I mean by proper deliberation is first ask the question, what kind of question are we answering? And how do we establish whether that answer is valid or sustained or not? And in this instance, we're asking a question that says, I want to know the process by which X, the previous state of affairs, became Y, the current state of affairs. The fossil record tells us that a long time ago was not the same as now. There was some period of time a long time ago where there were very few species. There was a long time ago where there was a lot of species that no longer exist. So how did we go from that time to this? Why does the speciation existent in the world today look different than it once did? That's one way to frame the question, right? What that begs for is a mechanism by which the change occurs. Now, the creationist explanation is that no change occurs. That, in fact, God put all the species here and that's it. As they are and they haven't changed. Evolution correctly notes that the status quo of the world, the number of species, used to be fewer and those species used to be simpler, and adequately, correctly-ish notes the branching out from apparently simpler forms into apparently more complex forms that's suggested by the fossil record. So it purports to explain what is apparently evident observed change. Note that it's not observed change of anything real. Anytime you're talking about evolution, there's a challenge in that there's a conflation between species, individuals, and genes. So, if I say, well, this trait was advantageous, and so it took over this subpopulation, and over time changed into a different species in that subpopulation, while the other subpopulation over there remained the same. So that's how we have some bunny rabbits and some hares who are a different species because they once were bunny rabbits, but they came over here and they have some advantage that made them bigger over here, where that advantage didn't play over there or something like that, right? Of course, the thing is, advantageous to whom? It can only be advantageous to an individual. Genes don't have a agenda, presumably, and the fact that something is good for a species is an abstraction, a metaphor. It's not the case that species have interests. It is the case that individuals have interests. And so what's odd is the idea that because something serves an individual's interests, that it becomes genomically prevalent or something. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense if you think about it, right? It's like there's shit tons of pigeons in the world, like billions of them. So what possible advantage could any individual pigeon have that could have any meaningful impact in the genome at all? It also just doesn't make sense because here's the most basic proof about why evolution doesn't make sense. It's that it's hard. The reason it's hard to prove it doesn't make sense is because nobody will articulate what it is exactly. Um, it's not adaptation to anything. It's not mutation anymore. It's not. They're not sure what it is, but they still claim to explain something. One reason we know that any conventional understanding of evolution is wrong is because if any of the mechanisms evolution suggests are responsible for speciation actually were responsible for speciation, then genetic diversity within a species would increase as population size increases. In other words, the genome of pigeons would be more diverse than the genome of California condors, of which there are very few. Um, it's simply not the case. The math disproves the notion that there is some sort of vector that expresses genetically, because if there were, we'd see subpopulations of pigeons in more challenging climates begin to change in some fashion, right? But we can test every element of evolution and conclude that it just doesn't make any sense. We've never observed any two members of a species give birth to anything other than another member of that species. And to the extent that we've observed them give birth to something that is a mutated version of that species, almost always that thing dies because mutations are almost always negative. And to the extent that they're not, they're at best neutral or nearly neutral. So you'd think that would, when you concluded that, in fact, the mutation adaptation angle of evolution, which was the fundamental engine of the thing in the first place, um, doesn't make any sense, is disproved by the nature of mutations and by all our observational data. Why not scrap the whole thing? Why cling to it and say, oh no, we just need to make some tweaks here? It's very reminiscent of what scientists did, or astronomers did, during Galileo's time, when the church insisted that the earth was the center of the universe and everything circled around the earth in perfect circles. And so, in order to both do science and adhere to the church dogma, they came up with ever increasingly complex models that involved ever more ridiculous levels of arbitrary complexity to justify what to try to fight against the obvious fact that the math wasn't working. It was wrong, you know? It's incredibly reminiscent of what's happened in evolutionary science. Incredibly so, because the original idea of evolution, Darwin's idea, has been completely put into the trash bin of history by actual evolutionary scientists who haven't replaced it with anything. They've replaced it with a couple of descriptions, such as punctuated equilibrium, which purports to explain the Cambrian explosion, but merely describes it without providing any mechanism by which the additional attributes to the processes of evolution now must carry. It's like, now also about evolution, here's something else now that we've included punctuated equilibrium. It enters periods of stasis and rapid evolution that switch on and off for no particular reason that has been explained, and there's no mechanism to understand why it would do that, or no attempt to explain that. Cambrian explosion defies everything you think you know about evolution, unless you're an evolutionary scientist, in which case you've got increasingly and ever more densely complicated attempts to explain what doesn't make any sense underneath the basic umbrella notion of evolution. Most people think, oh, well, we had 4.2 billion years to evolve. No, there have been multiple extinction events. The last one 66 million years ago, and the totality of current species basically emerged within a couple million years after the last extinction event in inexplicable fashion and haven't changed since. I mean, if in fact evolution were correct, then we could pressure a given species by breeding it to force it to adapt to selective pressures, as purportedly once was the engine of evolution. And we can maximize that vector far beyond anything nature can do. And if we were to maximize that far beyond anything nature can do, as we have with dogs, we discovered that no matter how hard we push on that vector, we can't create a new species. That would seem to falsify evolution. And so, well, you don't have long enough. I mean, we've done way more adaptive work in 10,000, 20,000 years than nature ever could, even if the mechanisms were right, in a billion years. In other words, we've established incredible differentiation within the species, so much so that if, in fact, we were to discover a skull of a chihuahua out in an archaeological dig and had no idea what it was, a skull of a wolf in an archaeological dig had no idea what it was for some reason, we would certainly conclude they were different species. Which is why evolutionary scientists have removed the reproductive viability definition of species and replaced it with nothing. It's hard to falsify something that's not making any real claims. What's a species, evolution? Oh, we don't define it anymore. Why not? Well, because of the thing you just said, Eric, about the chihuahua and the wolf skull. Okay, but so what you're saying is all the conclusions you've drawn about things being different species from the fossil record are specious? Because you don't define species, and it may very well be, if we use the old definition of species, that some of those two different looking skulls were actually the same species. Well, we've got genetic material from some of these. We can show, genetic similar. Now you're jumping back and forth between ground. Just because in the status quo we can show that there is this much similarity between the genome of this species and that species does not mean we come from a common ancestor. That assumes you're born foremost. I mean, it's begging the question. There's no reason to conclude that because it's a watchmaker's fallacy. Is another thing. It's like evolution is fundamentally a religious notion. It is saying, I will replace God's teleology with another metaphor of teleology called genes and genetics. Like, you can't talk about evolution without creating this imaginary interested party called your genes or your species that doesn't exist. So, how did Christianity force evolution on us? They forced it on us by saying that evolution was wrong because it conflicted with creationism. Now, if that's your argument, you should lose. And so I guess evolution won the round. And what it continues to do to this day is people like Bill and I seek out the weakest possible arguments against evolution, defeat them, and once again, claim victory for evolution. If any evolutionist wants to actually feel good about themselves or think they have any intellectual legitimacy, they should come debate me about the subject. I'm not making a dumb counter-advocacy. I'm placing the burden where it belongs, on those parties who claim to explain the origin of the species. And I'm asking them to substantiate that claim in any meaningful way, or even explain what their explanation is, or if they have a mechanism, or if it's just a bunch of smoke and mirrors. So if anyone out there watches this video and believes evolution is correct, then please come put your money where your mouth is by talking to somebody who actually is qualified to debate you and who actually uses the correct arguments. The burden is on you to actually explain what you purport to explain, providing a mechanism, providing predictions that we can test and falsify, and acknowledging if you don't actually have any explanation at all, as you will at the end of any debate with me on the subject. Now, if you are an evolutionist and you choose instead to go debate more creationists and pretend that defeating creationists is the same as affirming your bullshit affirmation, then you just go ahead and be delusional. But as far as I'm concerned, no one will ever be justified in believing in evolution until they have come and debated me and defeated me. If I get defeated by any evolutionist, I will switch my position 100%. I guarantee you. I turned out to be. I was very surprised when I looked into this. I thought it'd be a fun thing to negate because all smart people like evolution, so that makes it fun to negate. I genuinely was surprised to discover that I looked into it more and more and more. I kept expecting to say, okay, now I do get it. Okay, Eric, you're right. Okay, evolution, fine. Never happened. Became increasingly shocked at how weak the argumentation was, how much smoke and mirrors there was, how much avoidance there was, and how nobody could actually answer any meaningful questions about the thing. Now I'm utterly convinced that the whole thing is bullshit, and the reason is Christianity forced it on us by frame-walking us to believe that negating creationism is the same thing as affirming evolution. What has the world needed? Meta-analysts to articulate what has happened here and why. Meta-analysts to explain why evolution fails to meet its burden. A meta-analyst will say, let's stop talking about whether your specific contentions here are right. Let's start going back to the frame. What are you trying to do here? Okay, so what are you doing? Okay, you're explaining something. Good, okay. What are you explaining? Origin of the species. So your basic tenet, right, is that complexity emerges from simpler forms over time via adaptation. Is that correct? When you do it that way, it becomes immediately obvious that the person is not prepared at all to justify their conclusions. And I hope this video has sufficient, pull or whatever to bring somebody who's really, really smart, a really smart evolutionary biologist who's got PhDs and whatever else, to come answer my fucking questions. Because nobody has been able to before. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to eat plenty of cheese. If you do forget to eat plenty of cheese, please eat twice as much cheese next time, because otherwise you'll experience cheese deficiency syndrome.